In fact, women and children and refugees either are or most eventually become workers in the United States. There is no line between the family immigrant, the refugee, and the immigrant who comes here to work. And as this increasing bifurcation between the immigrants who give and the immigrants who take has captured Americans' attention, US employers have continued to demand more short-term visas for more high-skilled workers in order to remain globally competitive. The US economy continues to generate large numbers of low-wage and low-skilled jobs, which natives still avoid taking, and for which foreigners cannot acquire visas to fulfill. Now, if you've been here for 2 days, you know and have heard a great deal about Somali and Hmong refugees. All the case studies of their lives as workers in the United States contradict this myth that I have been describing for you. And in fact, considerable numbers of refugees, and even considerable numbers of so-called illegals, are highly educated, bilingual, and eager to work. Relatively few find work commensurate with their training. What's going on here? We're not using the skills of the immigrants who are being admitted. We're claiming that they're drains on our economy, and employers are demanding temporary visas for the truly highly skilled. While it is certainly important to acknowledge the impact of American racism on the day-to-day lives of today's immigrant workers, and while it is obviously the case that the reemergence of nativist hostility to immigrants draws on the long-term history of American racism, I increasingly believe that any solutions to the problems of US policy have to take into account the ways in which Class 2 has figured at the border. And I hope that I have given you enough food for thought to think about what the possibilities are for an immigration policy of the future, not a return to the immigration policies of the past. They were no better, or only modestly better, than what we have right now. Thank you very much. Questions, comments, disputations?
I see that you're drawing certain continuities between patterns of immigration historically and
That's
now.
my job. I'm an historian.
But my question is, in the entire discussion, most of the focus was largely centered around the political discourses that were generated, that resonated with certain social circumstances.
Yes.
Historically.
Yes, that's correct.
But now, given that your entire analysis is centered around class, my question is about how has these changes in American economy, given that American economy has moved on from early stages of capitalism to
Sure.
what we understand as advanced neoliberal capitalism, how has that affected patterns of immigration?
Sure, it's very simple and I can describe it very quickly. Wage earning in the early 19th century was still largely in what we would call service areas, you know, dock workers, domestic servants. The wage earners of the late 19th century are largely industrial workers, and wage earners today at the lower end are again increasingly attracted to service industries. One point that many people make when they hear this kind of analysis is to say, well, yeah, but it was a less mobile world then. I have to remind people that the numbers, and I actually like numbers too, I'm something of a failed demographic historian. There were probably proportionately just as many people moving outside of the continent of their birth in the late 19th century as there are today. The kinds of labor and the kinds of wages that they're chasing continuously have changed over time. And the rise in particular of women's representation is not just a result of reunification options, but also the growth of service sector employment in the United States. And I think your question also causes me to comment that I think in part the resentments that are expressed against contemporary immigrant workers are the resentments of people who once worked in industries, in unionized and good-paying jobs, who have seen those jobs disappear. Not because immigrants replaced them, but because both the global and the national economies have shifted and have begun to generate all of these lower wage service industry forms of employment that the unemployed, I used to live in Pittsburgh. Ex-steel workers drive taxis there. It's the only country in the United States that I think has white, not native-born English-speaking taxi drivers. And their resentments of this transformation do sometimes, I think, get expressed as hostility to immigrants who are understood to have taken their jobs.
Thank you.
Good talk, Donna.
Thanks.
So just to be clear, when you're saying we need to take into account class, which I totally agree.
Who's going to disagree here?
Yes, right.
Talking to the choir.
You're not simply saying, besides racial discrimination and nativist biases, there were also class biases, or anti-worker perspectives. Per the question that Ajay just, I think, was trying to tie your talk to Ajay's question, wasn't a lot of this about what it is today as well, which is cheapening the cost of labor. So,
Sure.
So when we're talking, this was not just about people being prejudices against workers. So,
Oh, okay.
and,
I see what you're saying.
yeah, I mean, so when we don't put quotas on the Western Hemisphere, it's not simply because we want to be friendly to neighborly.
But we don't want to insult them.
We don't want to insult them. It's because that notion of birds of passages was already very much beginning to take place. These workers who will come in and get out, and essentially sort of previous...
Yeah, well, to some degree that's true, Lourdes, but the bird of passage is an Atlantic phenomenon before it's a south-north phenomenon. The birds of passage are going back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean,
As well.
both South America and North America, well before 1924.
But there is learning. There's a learning curve when people begin to figure out, now in this new world market, in this new competitive economy,
The way I would
Chinese are now more expensive than Mexicans. So, I mean, isn't that a calculus? Because who is behind all of this?
It's possibly a calculus. It's also the growing political power and the changing political power of what we think of as now as the Sun Belt that used to be the South and the Southwest over issues of immigration. And we don't yet have a good study of the role of employers. We know the role of diplomats in exempting the Americas from the numerical restrictions. We don't understand as well the role of employers because they're operating through private conversations with representatives who only occasionally admit that influence in debates in Congress.
So maybe that is the one. I mean, I think that's one more dimension of all these historical trends that you're tracing.
Right. There's absolutely no doubt that both the U.S. economy and the global economy has changed over time. But I don't believe that that is what is producing a celebration of past immigrants and a denigration of contemporary immigrants. I think in both periods of time, working class immigrants tend to be racialized.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Because that's how you also accomplish a reproduction of cheap labor.
Right. And one of the reasons